Oh, there we go. Okay. So, basically, a stream management plan is a data-driven assessment of river health that helps communities prioritize and protect our environmental and recreational assets in the watershed. That's a definition provided by the Colorado Water Conservation Board about what a stream management plan is. Stream management plans are action oriented, so we are working to create something that produces actions. It's not just a plan that we're going to stick on a shelf and never look at again. We want the community to come up with ideas and actions that are helpful to the community. It's collaborative, so we're working with the county, we're working with Mesa Verde, we're working with the Forest Service, Town of Mancos Rural Water, as many entities as we can to make the stream management a collaborative effort. It's driven by data, so we are looking at all of this different data that has been collected throughout the watershed. Colorado River Watch, we have a lot of River Watch data. We have all kinds of different pieces of data that we're using to help create this stream management plan. It is a voluntary stream management plan. It's not regulatory. We're not regulating anything by landowners or ag producers or anything like that. It's a voluntary plan, which is why we want to be collaborative and get everybody's opinions and buy-in on the plan. And again, we're trying to make it really comprehensive. So we're looking at water quality, we're looking at water rights, we're looking at ecology, we're looking at town and municipal uses, we're looking at downstream, upstream, all the whole breadth of the watershed to try and make a comprehensive plan that kind of helps plan for this very big, diverse watershed. If you think about the headwaters all the way to the tribal lands, that's all in the watershed. And so it is we're trying really hard to make it as comprehensive as possible. One of the things that's kind of left out of this definition of a stream management plan is agriculture, which we've identified in this area in the Mancos Valley. Agriculture is a huge part of this valley. And so the Mancos watershed stream management plan is taking agricultural water use to heart as well and making that one of the main priorities in the stream management plan. And the priority of the stream management plan, the first one we have listed is to protect existing water rights. And so we are working really closely with ag producers through this agricultural committee to make sure that ag is brought into this plan as well. Because they depend on this water for their livelihoods as much as we do for our drinking water. And so agriculture is something that is not in that original definition that we as a community have identified and added to that plan as well. Just a quick overview of the process. You kind of start with like defining your scope and purpose, identify conditions and risks, set your objective, identify alternative actions, and then evaluate and prioritize actions. And so we're kind of down here in this phase where we're still kind of doing outreach. We're doing a lot of different outreach activities, and then we're starting to put it all together and kind of come up with these plans for what we want to put in the stream management and how we're going to prioritize them. Okay. From there, we implement actions, kind of monitor those actions and outcomes. Did it work? Did it not work? Adjust from there, which is that manage adaptively piece, and then we start all over. So I really like this because it's not something where this plan is written and it's done, but it's kind of this process that can keep going and keep changing and adapting as we learn about what the community needs. As the community's needs change, we can change those things and keep kind of adapting them in our plan. Some of this was specific for the ag meeting, so I'm going to skip a little bit of this. But we did have a watershed plan in 2011. And the main point here that we came out from this plan, we were looking at diversion points. We were looking at reducing salinity. We were looking at upgrading irrigation water. We were looking at connecting floodplains, looking at metal loading in the watershed, especially the East Mancos River. And once this plan got put together, was finalized, it's like over $15 million in projects that have come to this community through that 2011 watershed plan. And so that's the potential of this stream management plan that we have when we come together and identify these projects that really gives us a foothold to help to get these things happening in our community. Obviously, this was a long time ago, and a lot of those things have been accomplished. And so we wanted to to revamp that, come up with a new plan. Also throughout this watershed plan, we had a forestry information gap identified. We really weren't looking at forestry and healthy forests as part of the watershed, which we are taking into account with this stream management plan. And that's, Michael's going to talk a lot about that. But we've also been looking at drought modeling, which has been a big part of the stream management plan as well, that I'm not going to go into today, but it was identified in these previous plans. So this was kind of one of those pieces that helped us get to where we are. This is just a map of the watershed, just so you can see how kind of diverse it is. Up here, we have the Forest Service land all the way down, you know, we're past, this is Highway 491. Here, all the way down there. So we have a really broad variety of landscape types, uses, a very diverse watershed. And so that's what we're trying to capture and create a plan that is comprehensive for this whole area. And like I mentioned before, some of the goals that have been identified. First goal is ensure the protection of water rights. We're looking at improving our understanding of the Mancos River and its hydrology. We want to continue coordinated data collection and monitoring. So like I said, we're working with Forest Service, we're working with the tribe, we're working with Mesa Verde to collect data watershed wide, continue outreach and engagement. And then these are some of the big goals. Like we want to identify and implement projects. So like I said, it's not just a plan that we're like, oh, we want to do these random, nice, cool sounding things. We want to identify projects that we want to happen in this watershed and make them happen. So once we get those identified, it can lead us to these funding opportunities where we can make these projects happen, like we saw with that 2011 plan. Some of the potential benefits of a stream management plan, it could be water management. We could be looking at infrastructure upgrades. We could be looking at riparian restoration projects. Education is one that comes up over and over and over every conversation I have about what does the watershed need. It's education of some sort. So that's a big one. It could be policy, monitoring. Maybe we need more monitoring efforts, ecosystem services, recreation. We're also working with the town of Mancos to look at the recreational opportunities through the town, as that's a big part of the river as well. And I'm not saying like any of these are necessarily like the goals, but these are all things that could be potential benefits from having a stream management plan, depending on what the community wants. And then this guy's just a little overview of kind of where we're at and where we're going. So the stream management plan itself is not done until 2025. We're still in the pretty early stages. The goal is to have a first draft of the stream management plan done and written by February, the end of February. Then that'll go open to a public comment period where we get feedback from community members and experts, and the Ag Committee is going to be reviewing it. We'll be working strategically with community and partners to make sure that it gets good review. Then we'll craft a second draft by the end of September next year, 2024. We'll have another comment period through the end of 2024, and then we'll have our final draft of the stream management plan created by the end of March 2025. So it's a long process. We're trying to make sure we take time to do it right and make sure we're outreaching to the right people and getting time to create something that is meaningful to the community. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. So part of this, like I mentioned, we identified this need for forestry and this need to look at forests and how to protect our watershed in that fashion. And so we have partnered with Michael to help us kind of do that.
Great. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. This is a great brain trust in this room. Really excited to see the county here. I live in Salida, pretty similar, been there 12 years, pretty similar. I come over to Mancos and it feels kind of like home to me a little bit. I wish our streets were still not paved, but and a little jealous of the fruit tree growing you guys can do over here that I have challenges with in my yard. But yeah, it's great, you know, dealing with this, a lot of the same issues of, you know, some growth issues, ranching, agricultural, you know, heart base of the economy, and you know, but a love for the stream, love for the rivers, and you know, some different challenges in trying to make sure we're meeting the different various goals. So excited to see you all here, and hopefully this will give you, you know, it's one component of this, of the watershed management plan that's going on in Mancos. And I was tasked to look at fluvial hazard zones and like healthy stream corridors. So I'm going to give you an overview of kind of how we developed those maps, how we developed that program for the state of Colorado, and then kind of hone in down on what the big picture is here in Mancos, and kind of we can hone in once we understand that collectively, we can then start talking about projects and kind of, you know, we need to set the context first. When I moved to Colorado, people were like, you know, well, there's no water in Colorado. Do you do water rights work or low flow work? And I was kind of, came from Vermont, and I'm kind of, my specialty is river change. And I'm kind of like, I do too much water. I do big floods. I do river change. And oftentimes in our dry, you know, kind of arid west climate here, we have many, many years where there's not really very much water runoff. And then we have these episodic events. It might be a rain on snow event. It might be a wildfire and a rainfall flood on a burn scar. Whatever it is that's the causation, or, you know, a climate system like that happened on the Front Range that kind of backed up inside. Wherever it is in the state you are, we do get floods around here. They do happen, and when they happen, we often, you know, have big consequences because rivers change, and rivers have been changing way before we all got here, and they'll continue to change way after we're gone and done. So,
You want me to do your?
well, yeah, let me. Where's that remote? Is that old? Oh, there it is. Let me see if I can do this first. Nope. Can you click that? Oh, that's okay. So I guess it's not gonna be.
You can, I'll just push buttons, so that work.
Go away. Okay, so why do we care about floods? Well, floods are the most common, you know, natural disaster in Colorado. And one of the big issues why the state really got interested in this after the 2013 flood is because we find that more than half of the flood, you know, damage claims are coming from outside of these map floodplains. We have communities have, you know, these floodplains that are mapped with the help of FEMA. We use them to help develop like tax, you know, or sorry, insurance policies and that sort of thing. But they're not really great at capturing river change, especially in mountain communities where we have steepness to our watersheds and we have rivers that get energized. They weren't really made to account for the sediment and the debris and the other stuff that's coming down as the water's trying to wear that mountain down to the plains. And so we keep finding all these damages. So the question that's kind of hidden, can we move that, do you think? Because I'm probably going to run into that a few times, but there you go. Well, that works.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we're missing 50% of flood damages, how do we do a better job of accounting for the true hazards that exist in river corridors? Next slide. This is post the Decker's fire just outside of Salida, by the way. Oh no, sorry, Hayden Pass fire. That was some damage that occurred to some property that was hit by debris flows. So we developed the program, the Fluvial Hazard Zone Mapping Program, the Fluvial Hazard Program. And the fluvial hazard zone is defined as the area a stream may occupy or has recently occupied in recent history as it transports water, sediment, and debris. That's different. Now, if you're just looking at a floodplain model, they're typically only looking at water, right? So we're also looking at sediment and debris and how those things affect river movement, erosion, sedimentation, these dynamic processes that sometimes occur very slowly as a river's like creeping into a bank. And you know, our human time scale minds don't think about those time scales, but that river is changing incrementally, and sometimes those changes happen really drastically. Next slide. So big picture, the state got involved in this. So I'm representative today of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, essentially the kind of the state agency tasked with managing floodplains. The state got interested in this to try to account for this extra damage and wanting this to be a big resource for communities, for engineers, for planners, for emergency hazard planners, for transportation, for scientists like me doing restoration work, for conservation planners, for property owners, all those people. And ideally, we're trying to get better at it, managing our stream corridors for all the multi benefits that we have for them. Go ahead, next slide. So just to put this in perspective, this has become so important at the state level that it's in the Colorado Water Plan now, the new water plan that just came out. There's they're looking to quick map of kind of some of the other towns and communities that have had fluvial hazard zone mapping done. So, and this is about, the program was started because of hazards, but we also talked about calling it the fluvial opportunity zone, because there's actually a lot of like benefit and opportunity to letting, these kind of processes take place. Next slide. So we have floodplain maps here, Michael. Why do we care about this, right? There's downtown Mancos with its inundation floodplain map. So at one point, a hydrologist sat in an office and decided if it's going to rain this much amount in the upper watershed, we can measure the size of the channel, and we can say, well, that much water, our computer model is going to tell us that much water will fill that channel up. It'll spread out to a certain point on the land, and that is our floodplain. And unfortunately, communities use these maps to do a lot of planning and development stuff, but that model does not take into account that river changes. It changes location and it changes size and shape during a flood, especially when you've got a lot of sediments and debris coming down. And so, when the river gets dynamics, these maps sometimes start to not really do a great job of telling us the true hazard. These maps are still really important, but the true kind of river corridors, the better perspective is to take both of these kind of ideas and put them together, and then start to think about a river corridor that way. So next slide. So especially in tighter valleys, narrower valleys, sometimes the fluvial hazard zone, because it also accounts for the size of the channel that we're,
Sorry.
Oh, you're good. Looking at, these hazards of erosion, debris, sediment, that sort of thing, where river channel change, and oftentimes rivers will run into their margins, whether that's an old glacial terrace or whether it's a hill slope or whatever it is. And, if you have a house that is, so an inundation map is more of a floodplain map that's going to show you the area that's expected to kind of get wet. And that's fine, that kind of low-lying flooding. And that's certainly as you get lower in the valley here on the Mancos River, that might be more of the hazard. But in some of the steeper, tighter valleys, Chicken Creek and things like that, you've got a lot more stream energy and power and more erosive energy and forces sedimentation. So again, it's depending on where you are, one might be kind of a better true representative of the other. Go ahead, sense the next slide. This gets into the boring details, but we can find this on our website, and I'll give you that towards the end. But kind of just again, those ideas of one of them is assuming a static system, the other one's assuming really much more a dynamic system. One of them is regulatory, just so you all know. The fluvial hazard zone program is not regulatory at all. It's totally information for the community to utilize to the extent and purpose that it might. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna try something really quick. They said they can't see your presentation. I think.
Well, that's no fun.
I know.
Start it.
Okay. Okay.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so why this? Why for this? We don't want to ask for this here. I don't know why, why do we do this? So the idea is that to try to come up and look at some of the hazards, look at the stream corridor, look at the space that the Mancos River and some of its tributaries might want to kind of utilize for stream processes and functions, that if we can do some of this mapping, it's going to help. It might help, inform hazard management in the community. It might inform transportation decisions, county planning, and that sort of thing. But it's also going to help inform places that are, let's keep these places in agriculture. Let's keep these places, maybe this is a good area for conservation. This isn't, these are spaces where we can do some mitigation work today to prepare for tomorrow's flood, and start to think about how to, because we have developed in certain, areas where we have assets, that are maybe vulnerable today. So how can we think about these kind of corridor? Because a lot of people, one thing, you ask someone to draw a stream, draw me a river. What are most folks going to do? They're going to grab a blue pen, right? And they're going to, it's going to be off the screen, but they're just going to, that's a river. That's not a river. That's a channel. That's a channel at one snapshot in time. That channel has been back and forth over time. And so really a river is a corridor. And then there's water moving in the channel, yes, but there's also water moving through the alluvial soils below the channel, on the sides of the channel, as water, moves in from the hill slopes, hillsides. And so thinking about rivers as corridors is really, something that we're trying to do with this program. Next slide. Additional benefits, education, talking about these things, bringing them out to the public, to the open, looking at different scopes and scales, roadmap of where we might expect to have more energy and dynamicism in the river corridor. And then looking at, these restoration corridor, even like, wildfire breaks, things like that, might be able to, because we know like avoidance is definitely way easier to do than trying to, come in after the fact, after a flood and do recovery work. So if we can avoid some future, damages, then we're doing a good job here while protecting the asset, the resource and the water and all the things we care about. I just want to make sure that I've got a good watch. Is there a clock here? It's 12 o'clock. Okay, great. Good.
It's correct this
Okay.
time.
Yeah, I got a lot of ground to cover. I just want to, hopefully I'm not speaking too fast, or want to make sure that we're doing all right. Okay. So primary benefits, big picture, again, first and foremost, protection of life and property. Where we have, assets in the watershed in these corridors, we want to make sure that we're trying to reduce the risk. What can we do to mitigate? What can we do to avoid? How do we increase awareness? Providing, more accurate ideas of where true flood hazards exist, emergency planning, evacuation, that sort of thing. What roads might we expect to lose to erosion if we're thinking about, which assets, what transportation structure to protect. So we have egress and ingress, making sure that we're not putting, a lot of communities, gosh, during the 2013 flood, we had so many fire stations that were like damaged by floods, and you're trying to do emergency response and you can't get a fire truck out from your garage there, then that's problematic. So how can we help communities inform where some of these problems might be expected to happen in the case of a flood? Go ahead, next slide. I can make this all of it out too. I think it's like a lot of writing, and I'm kind of trying to cover the high points, but not every detail. So we can make sure this gets sent out to you all if you want to spend more time with it. And then we want to, one big one we've identified is looking at these kind of post-fire situation where we do have, the potential to have a big flood and a lot of sediment coming down after a fire. We can potentially identify areas that are, this is the Spring Creek fire over in Huerfano County, this Bluegill Hazard Zone map, and just looking at maybe some of the more, properties that might think that they were above, a flood elevation where they were going to get wet, but there's an erosional hazard to them. So trying to think about, are those folks prepared for, do we need early warning systems? Do they have ingress, egress, that sort of thing? And then if we are taking care of things and thinking about, more and more, healthy river corridors, wet sponges are being considered opportunities, beaver meadows and things like that, opportunities for natural fire breaks in the landscape. So we could potentially use these corridors as ways of thinking about where we might want to do some restoration work or protection work to keep those assets, in our community, to strategically utilize them for wildfire prevention or, spread. Yeah, sorry. And there's a good example. I don't know if it's a good example, but it's an example. Not that it's stopped the fire, but providing refuge and and that sort of thing can be just as critical. And attenuating sediments. So if you do have a wet, you might have a fire, but having these kind of wet, healthy river corridors that have the trees, have the wetlands and things like that can also help to slow and store sediments and flood water upstream of assets that we care about, like downtown Mancos. Okay, secondary benefits, obviously, we find a lot of infrastructure is put in river corridors. So we often have lots of damage to roads and culverts and bridges and things like that. So trying to identify where those hazards might exist and think about what opportunities we can do to protect those assets today or move them out of the hazard area, etc. Slide. Increasing awareness. These are kind of helping with stream planning and watershed scale management, which we're doing today. We're a small part of the bigger picture that is happening here in this watershed, as sentiment discussed. This is a small component of it, but hopefully useful and kind of fits together with the puzzle of all the things that it takes to manage and make sure that you guys are protecting your watershed. Opportunity zone and multiple benefits, open space, that sort of thing. Slide. Okay, how the heck do we create these maps? And what are the components of the maps? Most of you probably will never have to really deal with these, but some of you folks, we can get into more detail if you are using GIS and stuff like that, because that's a deliverable of this, is to actually have these corridors mapped out for you. There'll be draft. There's not, we're not doing third-party review here at this point. If you guys want to take them further, you will be able to, but essentially there's two main components, the active stream corridor and a fluvial hazard buffer, and we're gonna get into how those are kind of created. So I'm gonna go ahead, next slide. So one important point, unlike maybe the flood inundation maps that I was discussing for FEMA, where you've got a hydrologist and you've got a computer model, these maps are made a lot more with thinking about big picture processes, looking at everything from the glacial history, geology, soils, the stream corridor existing, where the stream was and how it was before we kind of got here and settled, to where, what changes have been made since that point in time, and then what the future trajectory is of that. Is it going to continue more towards a state of degradation, or a state of, is it rapidly changing? What can we expect of it in the future? So definitely different timescales and processes. I'm a fluvial geomorphologist, which is the study of how water shapes the earth. And a lot of fluvial geomorphologists are really good at looking at sediments and whether or not particles and gravels will move in stream systems. But my work is really heads up. It's looking at big picture landforms. And I do a lot of work by looking at, the scale of the river from up above, essentially using satellite imagery and what we call LiDAR and other, big picture topographies to try to think about these processes and timescales that are a lot bigger than us. And we're going to take a bunch of diversity of information, which I'll go through here to kind of bring that together. Go ahead. So first this is kind of it's not hierarchical, but it's gonna be hard to read, but geologic data, geomorphic and topographic, hydraulic and biotic. And we kind of put those together. Some watersheds, some areas we might have better information on than the other, but we're kind of using the synthesis of these different ideas and information that we have to try to help us understand where the river has been and where it may go again in the future. So geologic information, I didn't update this with Mancos, but I definitely looked at the superficial geology layers to try to figure out what's mapped as bedrock, what's mapped as alluvial soils, what's mapped as glacial outwash or other like shales and things like that. Try to understand what that can tell us about the history of where the river's been. And again, like that area, I often say what the river created, the river will take back. So trying to think about some of that information. The geomorphic and topographic, we'll come back to this because it's really particular to the Mancos watershed, but essentially looking at the setting of, if you're looking at a particular section of stream, again, like being on the ground is one thing, but you're also having to ask yourself these questions, where in the watershed are we? Are we up high in the steeper headwaters? Are the valleys confined? What processes are we expecting to happen? Is it very erosional? Or is it depositional? Is it a place where the stream loses energy and starts to spread out and maybe can't carry some of that sediment? So typically in the more confined, steeper reaches, like you have up here in the upper watershed, I'll show you some examples. That's where like sediment is coming down into the valley bottom, and that stream, that water is moving that sediment, moving those trees, moving it downhill. There's not a lot of place to store that sediment in a little tightly confined canyon or valley. But once those canyon walls go away and maybe the slope flattens, all of a sudden that water can't carry that sediment as much, doesn't have the energy to, so it starts to deposit out. And so then these are areas we often call, where it's transferring some of that sediment, or it's one flood, it erodes, the other flood it deposits. It's kind of an area, it's a lot of dynamicism. And that's where we find a lot of damage happening in floods. And then these lower lying areas where the stream has kind of like lost a lot of energy and you're just, it's moving small particles and you wind up having more, not that it can't do erosion, certainly it will, but the hazard starts to become more of the inundation, just too much water, flooding, a basement or things like that, foundation of houses, but maybe not enough energy to really do these kind of erosional, more drastic fluvial processes that we talk about. Okay, next slide. Again, this is just a different way of looking at it. Sources of sediment, where are they coming from? How is it being transported? How is it being deposited? Where, the erosional areas. So these are the things that I'm thinking about when I'm making these maps and looking at your watershed. Slide. I'm looking at sediment continuity. This is really too heady for this, not that you guys can understand it, but it's looking at all those different sources and then trying to understand where they might deposit based on different topographies and how that has shaped the river corridor and what we can see as we look at the different signatures that the rivers made over time on the landscape because of that sediment continuity. Go ahead, next slide. and energy flow. Is the river corridor, is it forested? Hasn't the forest been removed? Has it been paved? How is that energy of the water, gravity, water moving down through the system with sediments, and how is it interacting with the landscape? Next slide. Looking at hydraulics, which is tied to hydrology and precipitation and that sort of thing. What is the driver of floods in this state, or in this part of the state, in this region, in this watershed? Mostly, as we all know, it's snowpack. You guys had a great snowpack this year. Pretty lucky we didn't really have, I don't think that we had like a major rainfall event on that snow, right? So you guys definitely had a lot of high water. Everyone was like holding their breath for a few weeks. I was checking in, making sure things were, what was happening down here. But when what was the 1911 when the post office was washed out, and floods happen here, and it might not be in our lifetime, but there will be another one for sure. And also, of course, the monsoonal floods are probably a big driver here when we get these, this time of year, summer. And those are often located maybe more in a smaller catchment where it's just Chicken Creek that's going to get hit with like a flash flood kind of situation from a monsoon storm, and maybe not as widespread as like a rain on snow or snowpack type flood event. Okay, next slide. And then the biotic. How does the biotic processes and components of the river, how are they interacting and making that river either be more prone to change or less prone to change? And those are different things like beavers and large wood and other things like that. And how has maybe some of that change that's taking place? We know the beavers were removed from most of the arid west back, in the 1800s. And so a lot of our streams, without those kind of, biotic components in the watershed, the streams got faster, they cut down into their floodplains, they may be disconnected from their old floodplains, they change. So is that a trajectory that we can expect to continue today, or are things shifting and maybe shifting back? And how does that interplay with the nature of where the stream corridor is and compared to where it had been? Okay, so the two components that we then map when we talk about, we call it an active stream corridor. This is back to that definition of it's kind of the area of land we would expect fluvial processes to occur of water, sediment, and debris. Next slide. This is the St. Vrain River 2013 flood coming out of a canyon. This is the north. This is South St. Vrain. It says it's South St. Vrain Creek. So we'll go back to where we were, and then just to see that. And so we can kind of look at the landscape before flood and think about if you take away I'll show you some photos, but kind of look at like the channel has been, it's left signatures of being over on this landscape. So we're kind of like looking at that, looking at the geology. These are bedrock hill slopes. This is just where sediment, goes to and deposits, and that's where the river's been, and helping to kind of maybe identify that hazard for an active stream corridor. And then the next slide.
That's the slide went forward already, sorry. Go more.
Yeah, sorry, forward, forward. And then the other component that's a big part of the program is to what we call fluvial hazard buffer. Sorry for these words, are kind of terrible, but the active stream corridor is where we think that the river will be and interact, and the water will be and the sediment will be. But when that river course, when that channel interacts with a hill slope or a margin, a terrace or something like that, that's when we get erosion happening. And oftentimes we have a lot of damage in these places. If you go to the next slide, because we have folks that, it's nice to build near the river, you like the sound of the river, and you might be up high and you might have been told that you're in a fairly safe location. But when the channel moves into that hill slope, it can potentially expose, your property to some damage. So we try to, back to the prior slide. So we try to understand as best we can. This is not predictive. We can't tell you exactly where things are going to go, but we know that when the streams are tighter to the hill slope, we need a bigger buffer. And we know that when the stream is further away, it's a much wider floodplain, much wider valley bottom, that we don't need as wide of a buffer because it's less likely the stream is going to get over to and interact with this margin. So again, and this is again for planning purposes, just to try to help folks understand and make hopefully good land use decisions moving forward. Go ahead. Next slide. All this information is captured in these really rich information sheets that I wouldn't expect anyone to read. But if anyone like me comes in behind and says, well, how did this guy, what assumptions did he make? What observations did he make? Where did he get his data? Give me more information about this. They can refer to these. So each reach of the river that I look at, I collect all this information to try to be really transparent about what biases, assumptions, all those sort of things that I use to help inform the map making process. That all gets put into a map addendum so that folks like at the county here can get a quick background on the fluvial hazard program. Again, it's a summary of basically what I've talked about, talk about the components that you're going to find in the GIS files, talk about the mapping process, who did it, who was it for, and then go into the background of the study area. We're going to look at, I'm going to describe the geologic setting, where we are in the state, look at the hydrology and things like that, just to try to talk about all those things. And then getting into what I think is a geomorphic setting and the potential of these streams based on all that information. And then some different drivers and processes like bridges and roads and things like that that might kind of shift where hazards exist. So that's all one of the deliverables that I'll be giving the conservation district is this map addendum along with the GIS files. And try to write it in a way that's very digestible. Next slide. Importantly, with the GIS files, you'll appreciate this metadata, just where the information came from and what data sources were used to compile it. So we make sure that stays with the GIS files as well. Next slide. Okay, this is where you all came from. Findings and deliverables, or just findings, I guess. Right. So back to this slide about this setting. This is actually, we didn't design this for the Mancos River watershed. It's actually kind of spot on because even the way that the mountains are kind of, east to west there, it's a kind of snapshot of what we have. So if we go to the next slide, our upper watershed will cover the area. We didn't study the entire watershed, but we looked at some of the major tributaries coming out of the steeper mountain canyons up above town here. Next slide. And this is what it looks like. This is a bare earth image of, it's called LiDAR. So it's remove the vegetation and show me what the bare surface of the earth looks like. And again, I'm studying how water shapes the earth. So I'm looking at these maps in great detail. We can zoom in great detail and start to look at what features are created by, mountain building, which features are landslides, which features are glacial outwash terraces, things like that. And then again, look at that perspective. And so what we have here in the upper watershed is we have a lot of high elevation, small streams starting collecting water, and then for the West Fork and the Middle Fork and the East Fork, those watersheds, those upper watersheds quickly funnel into steep canyons. And those steep canyons continue for quite a ways until all the way down to here, till we're just about in this wide valley, like the Mancos Valley down here. And if you are looking at that slide of sediment production and sediment transport, and then sediment deposition and reactivity, well, there's not a whole heck of a lot of places to deposit sediments in any of these steeper canyons. And so all that sediment coming off of the upper watershed winds up getting funneled down into especially this upper pocket here above town. Next slide. And so this is zoomed in at the mouth of those canyons. This is the East Fork, correct me if I say something wrong. Middle Fork, West Fork, and then Chicken Creek over there. And so what we decided to study was that we can't really control, there's not a lot mapping the river corridor up in these upper watersheds is not going to be very fruitful or productive. It's pretty obvious where the stream is. It's the bottom of the valley and it's right there. It's where all the wood is, it's where the river's been and boulders are and things like that. But as it comes out of these canyon mouths, where is that area that the river has occupied and where might it occupy again? And how do we kind of put that down on a map to help you all with your planning efforts? So, and it's interesting because you have this expansive pocket kind of at the mouth of the canyons. but then it narrows down again as the river kind of gets funneled through some old depositional deposits that are much higher. The town's built largely on one of them. And then the corridor is kind of like, tucked down. Of course, there's the built environment down through here where it's really small. But then you get another kind of deposition accumulation zone down below town, kind of near the confluence of Chicken Creek, where again, it flattens out and the floodplain widens out. And this isn't a surprise. I mean, this is the floodplain map's going to show the same thing and like this, expansion and contraction and expansion again. But that's from like a sediment and debris purpose. These are certainly, especially if there's a wildfire or a big flood in the upper watershed, these areas are going to be very dynamic. And then it's going to be pretty more transfer and responding areas in the middle, and then another accumulation zone downriver. Next slide. Okay, so let's zoom in on what we're talking about here. So this is just to show you kind of what I'm seeing. This is, again, bare earth surface. I make what's called a relative elevation model, and it helps me to just pick out with the different colors, kind of like how high different things are in the floodplain. But you can see this is why I say a stream is not just a line, because there's all sorts of little lines where the river's been in the past, where it's, created these formations on the landscape. So we're kind of looking at that sort of thing. And then we're also asking ourselves, well, which ones of those were from some event 10,000 years ago and not realistic to today, and which ones are realistic given our current climatic and hydrology and sediments and all that sort of thing. Next slide. So now we'll go ahead, next slide. So this zoned in here on the or downtown transfer and response. These are going to be dynamic areas, but they're it's where energy sediments moving through the system because of the narrowness, but it's also depositing. So it's really hard to predict in these systems which way, if the river is going to zig or if it's going to zag. I can't tell you. I mean, it's hard to predict anyway, no matter what. But at certain points, the river, if you pick one parcel here, the river maybe has a trajectory of it's eroding towards the northwest, but a flood, you've got a bridge down here, could clog, could trap sediment and debris from moving through, and it could certainly just as easily one flood be going to the northwest, and the other flood be going to the southeast. So it's a really dynamic system. So just trying to think about our land use decisions and stuff within that becomes important. Next slide. Chicken Creek. Next slide. Yeah, again, kind of transfer of sediments, but also responding. It's trying to deal with as sediment comes out of that upper watershed. It's trying to store it, but it's also eroding and creating new sediment as it erodes into its quite dynamic hill slopes here, and a system that at times to us can seem really stable, but then at other times, in the long-term picture is actually doing quite a bit of work here, trying to create and move sediment through its system, create floodplains, erode banks, give space for itself. And so, yeah, it's quite dynamic down in there. Next slide. Okay, so looking at this, so what do we do with this, right? What strategies and opportunities can we kind of deploy in your community to maybe try to mitigate some of the existing flood hazards that are there for existing assets like property, and also just improve the health and function of the corridor. So I've identified 4 major categories for that. One would be floodplain restoration, reconnection, where we have the space to. Let's try to give the stream as much room as it can. Try to give it back some of its natural floodplain. Make sure that we have the components in there that are the basis of a healthy stream corridor, vegetation, if they're beavers or whatever it might be, to the extent that we can, and to the extent that we can work with landowners to do that. Where we can and where the opportunities exist to do some conservation in some important areas, especially where there's a lot of dynamicism, are there opportunities to work with the local land trusts or just whatever it might be, make sure it stays in agriculture, for instance. That's a great land use because it's we're not putting life and property necessarily in direct danger, especially like housing developments and things like that. Hazard mitigation, trying to think about where we do have some structures or whatever that might be it's a great time to be, trying to apply for transportation, retrofits and improvements and that sort of thing. So where we have some structures that are maybe causing existing hazard, and we could do some work today to try to reduce that hazard for the future. And then retrofits and public infrastructure, very similar category. I did create a map of culverts and bridges crossings to the extent that I could, that I'll give to you all, and made some notes about them. Don't know the extent that you guys have this already, but it's certainly because typically most of the structures here are undersized. They were sized to transport water, but they weren't sized to transport sediment and debris like trees and things like that that'll fall into the creek. So when the channel is coming down and it hits the blockage, hits one of these blockages, it's more likely to become erosive and or create flood problems, to properties upstream or downstream that are that constriction forces the channel to all of a sudden, become really, unhappy, unstable. Next slide. And so, I got, there's photographs and things like that. This structure, run me the road that's on.
That's on L.
Oh, yeah, everyone knows that one, right? It made it.
It made it, didn't it?
Made it with a little bit of love.
Yeah.
A little bit of work. I mean, it needs to be, if we want to keep that road, and it really, and it's a fish passage ecological issue too. So hopefully we can try to find a way to do a better design and improvement on that. But there's a lot of these everywhere, and it's an interesting. This is Chicken Creek, looking upstream. This is the highway crossing. It's grossly undersized, and yet if there was a flood, it would act as almost a de facto dam. The highway would. Water and sediment would back up behind it. And in a way, it would give some protection to downstream, but it's really hard to predict what would happen in that situation, because you could also overtop the road, wash the road highway out, which I'm sure they wouldn't want to see. You could, and then when you disrupt sediment transport on the downstream side, it could become more erosive. And there's property on the downstream side of all these culverts. Here's another culvert where it's fairly undersized. It's Chicken Creek, and you've got a property just upstream. So, we can think about things. We might not have the money or capacity to replace every one of these, but their potential just to think about in your planning, but also to think about if there is an opportunity, or if this culvert does wash out, please don't put it back. Take the opportunity to put something in that's actually truly appropriately sized. And then we can do other things where maybe this structure stays in place, but maybe there's a flood, like a relief culvert or something like that, or structure that's put into place to try to, this becomes the work of engineers and not necessarily fluvial geomorphologists, but happy to have the conversation and talk about where some of those potential solutions can come up. Okay, next slide. 12:30, great. So in this document, that's also deliverable, I start looking at some of these projects and calling some of these more specifically out, with thoughts of, why I think it's a potentially good project, what some of the intent justification is for it, a description of the project, the benefits of doing the work, who partners might be, Forest Service, county, whatever it might be, and then a really broad just swipe at what the cost might be for to do it. So, and I do want to preface this by saying that part of the meeting today, and I want to save time for it, is to get your all's opinions about what are we missing and what other projects. And I can't share, I haven't shared all the projects with you, but let's just talk about where things are. And I've given a draft deliverable to my client here in the conservation district, but there's still time for me to finalize and make sure that I'm capturing everyone's kind of, not everyone, but capturing as much of the need and intent of the community as possible. Okay, next slide. Hazard mitigation, what can we do to protect existing property? This is, a good example. This house isn't going anywhere. We hope. We certainly, we want that house. It's an investment that someone's made, but there's also an S turn in the river, and a fairly undersized structure, so. Can we do anything today to try to reduce some of the hazards of that property? Just, it's also just. Could be one of those things that it's just really hard to react when there is a flood happening to try to do something, so it's like, if we can start thinking about. If there's an opportunity to do, this would be a great place for some additional maybe flood relief structures, or. If that's already on your list for structure replacement anyway, because it's aging or because there's some other issues that I don't know about. Then, how do we, maybe this helps you elevate it even further on your list of like priorities. I know, I'm sure there's lots of priorities and, too few time and money and all those sorts of situations, but, yeah, trying to give you an idea of some of the ways that we can do some things to try to protect property that exists. Next slide. And then restoration and conservation, and I heard you guys did a project this summer. Last year. Oh, last year, okay, yeah. Was reading about it.
Will be another this fall.
Okay, great, yeah. So particularly, this is back to those, like the mouth of the canyons, east, middle, and west Mancos creeks, rivers that, you've already got some large lands that are under conservation easement, which is great. But is there opportunity maybe to extend those further down? Knowing very well that protecting this area from development, protecting it from just making sure it's kind of stays as a sponge, if you will, to try to like store some of that flood water and sediment that will come down. You alluded to forestry issues, and actually, I'm not a forester. I can't tell you exactly where the fire is going to be or how intense it's going to be. And I don't know that any amount of thinning in the upper watershed is really going to do much, because at some point there will be a fire. There will be a flood, water will come down. So one thing we can do is try to think about where that water and sediment is going to go and try to do some good healing and restoration work. Some of this river's been channelized over time. It's been dredged, there've been berms put up there. Is there any opportunity to start a conversation with these landowners that live in this corridor and start to think about, is that something that needs to be maintained? Maybe there is. Maybe it needs to hit a ditch and a diversion that we have to make sure that that channel is in that location. But where we don't have those constrictions, or we don't have a bridge to get through or something like that, then maybe we can look to allow some more expansion and do some projects. Like I understand you've been doing up in some of this region to kind of reallow the river to have some space and recreate that natural sponge. Next slide. Great, and then yeah, big picture stuff. What do you guys do with this information? Hopefully, like in my county right now, we're incorporating it into our comprehensive plan in Chaffee County. We're using it and at least talking about it in our updated code, our development code. Getting it into our local county emergency folks are super interested in as well, because it's getting into their hazard mitigation planning. Pre-disaster recovery plans, all that stuff. And I can send information to you guys specifically on some of the other documents and resources we have for folks at the county to try to like think about how to incorporate these kind of maps into different planning that you're doing. Because the community is doing all sorts of planning, whether it's open space and parks or capital improvement stuff, stormwater. It can all be potentially just let's bring this layer of information into all the rest of our decisions that we're trying to make anyway, and try to just make a better informed decision, hopefully. Next slide. We're trying, and again, this is not regulatory unless you choose to make it so, but state has no interest in regulating this, but hopefully it's conveying, information to landowners about hazards, and maybe thinking about ways that we can do development work in the future that uses some of these tools that are again, they're not my specialty, but things like transfer development rights, clustering, trying to move housing and development outside of the fluvial hazard zone, and maybe you get density bonuses or whatever tools that you might be using in your community. Next slide.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, well, again, like this, we did write a model ordinance if a community is interested in doing any sort of zoning with this, like a river overlay zone or something like that. But that's that exists, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it further. Next slide. Yeah, we found that after a flood, there's often a time right in the immediacy where people want to get out in bulldozers and try to put the river right back where it was. And we found that that's actually winds up doing a lot more damage than it needs. Than it has in the past.
Gonna do what it wants to do.
So some communities have chosen to do like a post-disaster moratorium and try to think about different ways to just, let's take a breath for a second and think about what did the river tell us and how we might use that information moving forward. Maybe there's an opportunity to do some, whether it's a buyout or, just try to think about not having repeat mistakes being made. Next slide. Mitigating actions, yeah, that's kind of what we're doing here, trying to just think about, we can think about stream corridors as natural infrastructure, it's like, just like a utility or a road or whatever, stormwater drain, a river corridor can in its own way be a natural asset and infrastructure for our communities. So yeah, trying to kind of identify, and that's led, I know Boulder County has like a program now, it's piloting with FEMA to do buyouts using some of these mapping. To try to just think about, one thing that when people are in stream corridors, they might have flood insurance, but well, first of all, if you're in a 100-year floodplain, you're over the course of a 30-year mortgage, you're 25% likely to be flooded. So the people don't think about that very often. They're like, oh, 100-year flood, it won't 100 years, that won't happen. But the actual percentage of chance of being flooded is 25% over a 30-year time frame. And then also the money that you get back, I forget what the number is, but it's really low. It might be maxed out at, is it 300K or something like that? So if you do have like a very valuable house, then you're not, it's not like your whole house is insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. So anyway, we want people to have flood insurance if they maybe are outside of a floodplain, but they're in a fluvial hazard zone. You can get insurance really cheap and maybe help out, think about reducing some of your risk, but then also, yeah, just I don't know, again, communicating and starting to talk about these things, and just awareness is pretty important. Next slide. Next slide. That's why I should go back to that one. It's like there should be a photo there. Yeah, I think that's okay. It's covered, already been covered. Next slide. So for those folks wondering, all this and more is on the state website, coloradofhz.com. We've got this great videos. It's like a 7-minute video that does a much better job of describing some of this than I did. Frequently asked questions, more about the program, and importantly, resources. And if you go to the next slide, we have lots of different resources and tools. We've got the quick start guide for planning, which is really useful. It covers a lot of those topics. And then the zoning overlay, quick fact sheet in case you're like trying to talk to a neighbor about this or something, and it does a pretty concise job of describing the program better. And then more tools for GIS, like we have our relative elevation model tool, which is really neat, which I can share with you. And then the protocol and that sort of thing. Next slide. Okay, my take homes: streams are corridors, not lines. They're dynamic and they adjust over time. Definitely, the computer mapping models to make floodplains is one effort, and it's important, but also looking at big picture change and protecting river health and function through fluvial hazard, corridor mapping is important. Let's see, these are cost effective. They're, and I guess this last one I want to touch on is you don't need a large scale program or regulation in this community to start enacting these, start using these maps today and start just talking about this, and hopefully it's, get incorporated into the watershed management plan is another tool of trying to think about, what opportunities exist and how do we overlay that with better understandings of where needs are for irrigators, where needs are for where the community is thinking about, developing in the future. I know we're talking about restoration, conservation stuff, and yeah, just lots of again, thinking about these landscapes and how critical they are. So making sure that as your community moves forward, we don't, don't lose these assets and maybe recover them to some degree. So I think that's where I end up. I put the other slides, I think they're extra.
Sweet.
And then I've got other resources that I can share with you, but want to leave for questions and just discussion.
I'm curious about downtown Mancos,
Yeah.
or some of the development
Yeah,
that's going on. Have you taken a close look at that?
I did the mapping through downtown. Let's take a, I wonder if I can,
You want me to stop sharing? You can try to share?
I wanted to bring up the web map because then I can actually like in real time. See, we'll see if my computer, if the Wi-Fi is gonna behave. Can I send you this website?
Mhm.
So yeah, downtown Mancos, I'm gonna talk about it a little bit. It's the downtown Mancos benefits to some degree because of that landscape upstream of Mancos. You know, if that landscape upstream gets developed and that, you know, that water and sediment is channelized and funneled right into downtown, then we're gonna have a lot more problems. I think there are small opportunities to try to reduce some of the flood hazard downtown. You know, it's tough. We're not moving the community, you know, and so, you know, there's already been a lot of, you know, investment in the community in town. Let's see. Reply to you there. Yeah, that sense. You bring that up. Great photo.
I froze it so that you didn't all have to see my inbox, but
We could have a 5:30 this morning. We're tired. There's that little pocket park just upstream of the bridge in town, where the bakery is. So this bridge. What's the history of this park here? Because the building, I know it's not. Okay.
Yeah.
it's for sale.
Because, yeah, but it's interesting because it's higher than the land across the street from it, across the river from it. It's an opportunity, I think, to maybe do some, if it's going to remain just a public space park, is there an opportunity to actually lower that, make that a floodplain? So that water would actually go over that direction instead of the houses and infrastructure that's on this side of the creek. It's like, it's a little project, but it might provide a little bit of flood relief. You've got the new bridge, that's great.
It is currently on right now, yeah.
Yeah, private landowner that's asked to.
Okay. See, that's the problem. I've got great ideas, but
Yeah,
they're like, yeah, how many of them actually have your kind of knowledge of the community, you know, stuff. Okay, yeah, so then
Am I
Go to
still-
explore.
hold on, I don't know if I'm still sharing for our Zoomer people. If I just click this, will it share everything?
yeah,
Okay. That might be easier.
great. And then go down to explore down here. Okay, so then this is a web map, just a drafted one, but I can, at least we can zoom in on things.
You want my spot?
Yeah, maybe. Okay, so, yeah, this is take a look at the bare earth or the satellite. But yeah. Oops. Sorry. No mouse.
Just click that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the channel's been straightened here through over time, you know, and then further developed. So the process that's gonna happen here, because of the energy that's confined in the channel, if there's a large flood, it's mostly probably gonna be widening. It's where the river is going to try to work against the banks. And if the banks are armored, then the river will try to cut down into the bed of itself, which then will undermine some of that historic armoring or foundations of buildings. I know there's a project that's underway to try to put some structures in the channel to try to keep it kind of aligned. Overbank flooding, it's already, if you look at the floodplain maps, which I don't think I uploaded on this. I could easily show you the floodplain maps, but they look really similar. It's, this crossing is, is one of the first crossings, so. What's happening upstream of here, I think is, you've got there's the RV park, or campsite place. You can see the rivers kind of has these like erosional features where it's tried to, go and be in the past. It looks like that's a berm probably where the river was trying to go this way. And they tried to redirect it back in. It's just the river's trying to get through these places. And then it has to hit this one narrow point here. This is an area where, and same thing with this other one. Oh, sorry, I gotta turn the parcels off. Where you would expect, potentially, and again, this is a berm that someone, was put in to try to channel the river through this structure. It's these where the river gets neck down, trying to get through these bridges and structures. It becomes more challenging for the river to transport sediment and debris. And so it becomes more likely that during a flood, they will plug. And, and then there'll be more at what we call aggregation, the deposition of sediments, and then more erosion and river movement. The channel will kind of move around as it's trying to work its way around and through that constriction. So, thoughts? How else can I?
Yeah.
I don't know. Trying to.
Thank you.
There's not a lot. I didn't see a lot of opportunity in the downtown in terms of restoration protection. I do think it's interesting that, oops, I go. Other than that, mentioning that little floodplain pocket, like this plug of sediment here. This high ground that maybe could be lowered. The river looks like this is like a low path here. I think this is it's like a workforce develop.
That is
It's crossing
alpaca.
What is it?
That's alpaca.
Yeah, okay. Just
alpaca
keeping,
grass.
and there's a driveway here. We can actually keeping that. Because I bet, if that bridge plugs. Water, sorry, folks.
The highest I've seen it would have been in about the late 70s. Where that bridge that it was replaced a year ago, but that was actually laughing under that bridge.
Was it? Yeah.
And that low spot there behind the junior high school, that was covered with water.
Downstream here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this in a way, this is the flow path. If this bridge did plug, the low spot is through here, so through these buildings.
Yeah.
In a way, keeping that open, at least it's a driveway.
Yeah, there's buildings on both sides. Keep that open.
Yeah, like this, these buildings are here. And they're probably not going anywhere, it's fine, but at least keeping this as a planned overflow channel, I think is important, and the water will come back downstream.
What about to the north of that?
Yep.
The old
Yep.
bank.
Oh, where's the old bank that got washed out in the flood? I think. Is that true? No, it's the post office that got washed out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it
Worried
really-
on that corner.
Yeah, as we know, there was a little bit of erosion and things happening down in the park down below there. What was that Cotton?
Cotton.
Yeah. I think the challenge is for all of us, and it's a challenge for me too, is to try to understand the potential of this river. Because we don't usually see it with that much water in it, you get snowpack, and then, then as soon as, irrigators are taking water off of it, and it's just even this high water year, it started to wonder if it was gonna like pull some trees in or, what banks it was gonna erode, but it still wasn't like a flood. And it's just really hard to try to think about these things. It's hard for me to try to understand what the potential of the channel is and where water and sediment may go. And the benefit, again, if we zoom way out, is that you've got this good land upstream, that like at least the town's not, some of the towns like don't tell me why I said this, but you got Creed, you get, Crested Butte, other communities that are built right at the mouth of like these steep canyons.
Lake City.
Thank you, yeah, exactly. I mean, we're doing a study up in Lake City right now, so, right, yeah. So,
I spent 2 weeks up there.
yeah, it's right, it's kind of in the line of fire for things, and that's where we might be more prone to be like, yes, go up and let's try to think about where we can do some forestry work to try to reduce the severity of fire. I don't know, I'm really curious to see what kind of forestry management planning might come out of here, and how obviously the drinking water supply for the community is a huge issue, and I've talked about it with you all about, I don't know, we didn't do the study up to it, but obviously it takes up above Jackson Lake up here, but you're in that confined, it's a confined stream corridor. There's not, the river doesn't have a lot of place to go in there, because it's sorry, I don't know exactly where it is. It's around this way, but it's confined by the valley, the bedrock valley margins. And the best thing I can think of is to think about the community thinking about a redundant system somewhere. So if there's a wildfire, if there's a flood, there's a lot of ash and sediment and debris coming down, and it's causing issues for taking off of, for water supply. Maybe that's when you fire up the well field or something like that to make sure the community has water. Because I don't know that you can do enough forestry work to it's a lot of cutting. I don't know, you're like deforest the whole watershed, to try to, whoops, sorry. Yeah, right. And with other impacts as well. So Chicken Creek's an interesting one to me. Sorry, what am I doing?
I'm making him use my Mac.
It's set up to zoom like the opposite way. I zoom. Yeah, Chicken Creek's interesting. The watershed above is not as steep as the Mancos River, but it does kind of come out of a more tightly confined canyon. And then let's see if I can just write. Nope, chose wrong. Come on. Maybe I'll. Yeah, and then it starts to be an area where there's opportunity for deposition, it's doing some erosion. You potentially have a couple little fans that come down for debris fans from some tributaries. These are the pink triangle that's on the map there. Yeah, and I think here, especially eroding, this is the exact kind of place where where you might get that. I want to zoom in. What the heck? That's where I was trying. All right. Where we want to make sure just that if proposed developments right on top of you might be out of the corridor is pretty. It's where the willows are. It's pretty defined down. You kind of look down into the bottom down there where Chicken Creek is, but it will continue to work against these margins, and then you just want to make sure that we've got, and I don't have the fluvial hazard buffer on here, but there'll be a margin, another line that'll basically try to express, where we might expect the river to kind of cut into the hill slope in the future. So, yeah. And then of course, all that sediment and water is moving down through the system, snaking its way in the north side of town here. There's definitely, some encroachment of property and stuff that down in the stream corridor. And we want to make sure that sediment and water can kind of get through, this is a particularly tight corner here. It looks like the channel used to run through here, right? It's this low spot. And at some point, this decision was made to keep it up in here and, I don't know, it's a really interesting one, but I don't know if there's a culvert here. Like, there probably is just for drainage. But maybe trying to, think about, I don't know, is this an opportunity? And this is a major highway too, so it's also like, this will easily fill in with sediments, and then you're gonna have a lot of pooling of water back here in sediments if there is a major flood. What's the low spot and where's it gonna go? My guess is that eventually it might top over the road here and then, causing just other headaches for everyone and potential people that didn't think they were anywhere close to I don't know if there's anywhere close to being flooded. I guess there's that property owner right there. So. Yeah, and then it does it again, just down here a little bit, trying to neck down through a really tight undersized structure. So. Yeah, so hopefully this will give you just, a tool for thinking about these things, and I can't make a prediction of, again, whether the river is going to zig or zag or when the flood will be, if there ever will be one in our lifetimes. But I feel like if there are opportunities that come up in the community, and we can start to just think about the space the stream needs and try to respect that through just good decision making, then I think we're all going to be better off for it. Yes, sir.
My first one was like, what it sounds like you've already talked about is they're putting their study extend to what's the most important thing in the community, which is that internet for now, Jackson.
Yeah.
And what can we do? We're talking about forestry in our last meeting, and I guess we need to talk about open. So it's something I haven't really explored. But I don't know, today more we could do the outside on that kind of was in that fund. Then my second question is, you're the bench, which most of your accumulation of the map is.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Usually more of this.
Okay, great.
Conservation of the West.
Okay.
There are. One, few probably, lowest, and probably written about lessons on places with living.
Okay, yeah.
This kind of
Yeah.
thing. And I guess I want to ask you about both what you see happening, that's I should ask this.
Mhm.
And or what could happen that would be beneficial to the town, what could happen that would be beneficial to us in our place. And also ask you about, you're opening the middle of the east bank, the middle definitely, the east too is strictly one of the steepest streams, it's not the steepest stream, but it travels the most elevation and the shortest distance.
Okay, well, yeah.
In Colorado, or something, it's like, and I don't know what the effects of that on you. You've heard one thing that get beaver dams on the upper part because it's so steep, and certainly all people just to go and put their beaver analogs in, all got washed in,
Right.
washed out in our place this year. But also, around that time, I see they cut deeper and deeper, and it's because it's so steep and level severe where it opens out. So, what do you see? What do you see happening? What's the optimal thing to happen? That kind of those kind of problems.
Okay. Great questions. Right, let me start with water supply. Not an expert in this, but there are communities. I know, like with the Glenwood fire, there was, I think it was Silt that was, or Glenwood that was putting in monitoring systems in the stream, using some like water quality sensor stuff to, if you did have a fire up there, that you could, when the water's clean and clear, be pulling off, because I think it pulls off into Jackson Lake.
Mhm.
And then, if there's a slug of sediment coming down, silt, turn off the intake, protect that intake infrastructure. Kind of like management. So management is one thing, redundancy, backup system. I don't, I looked at that, you know, I did like the aerial flyby, a lot of it's pretty remote, to try to, you know, looking at the aerials and trying to understand what's happening, and there's only just a very few little pockets of valley bottom up there, where maybe there's some beavers or just like where sediment might accumulate, but it's, I just don't think you can do enough to try to change the sediment that might come down from the wildfire, from what I've, you know, what I've been able to observe and witness. Too much, and even if you caught the bigger sediment, just the fines and the silt and stuff like that would be a total foul in your system, so. I don't know, I think, yeah.
We're screwed.
I didn't say it.
I have a question about the
Yeah, yeah.
too. I'm gonna.
You go and start kind of thinking about it, once you de-escalate a lot of things. I think, you know, you just gonna have more seven.
You certainly,
So
Run
I
that
really
potential.
hate the year when you start, oh, we'll go out there and cut down all the trees and that would fix our problem.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's gonna create a worse problem.
it's going to create a problem, for sure, different, appropriate action is reaction, right?
Right.
But it's hard to know, yeah, which, you know, but yeah, I've seen that around Mother Pass, a lot of sediment coming down from hitting activities.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's commercially driven,
yeah,
you know, it's not ecologically driven, the logging. It's happening for profit.
Carol, I would have to say that. Some of that thinning is, some of that thinning is trying to keep the trees healthy, to keep the beetles from killing them. Keep the, you know,
That maybe the private land doing that with the commercial. That's not their fault, but I don't feed into the bees, extraction. So, I mean, we're talking about two different things. Well, I see what you're talking about, and I support that, but that's thinning, not logging. Right, the difference in talking about and.
there are thinning